What can we learn from the wild horses that would greatly improve the life and health of our own domestic horses? Did you know that colic and laminitis don't exist in the wild? At first glance, it may seem like domestic horses have a much better life than wild horses, but when you take a deeper look at how horses have evolved and what their true biological needs are, you may be surprised at what you find. I'm going to teach you 5 lessons from the wild horses and how you can implement them in your own domestic horse's life to improve their physical and emotional health. And at the end, I'm going to tell you what they all have in common and how they all tie together. Lesson number 1. Wild horses are nibbling on low sugar, high forage fiber all day long. They never eat a big meal and they never go hours without eating anything. Why is this better for them? There are 2 reasons. It prevents stomach ulcers and it prevents colic, which is the number 1 killer of domestic horses, and it just does not exist in the wild. Horses have evolved to have a very small stomach, and that stomach is always producing hydrochloric acid, whereas we humans only produce hydrochloric acid when we are actually eating. This difference is very important. Because horses are always producing that stomach acid, they need to have food in their stomach for that acid to digest. If they don't, the acid will start to build up in the stomach. Now, the stomach is divided into 2 sections, the bottom and the top. And the lower half is protected by a mucus coating, so it does not get damaged by the hydrochloric acid. The top half, however, is unprotected. So when the horse goes several hours without eating anything, that acid starts to build up and it can splash onto the top unprotected portion of the stomach, and that will cause ulcers. Now, this could be worse than if you were to go ride your horse, tighten the girth, and have the horse trot around. The splashing of the stomach acid would then be worse, and the ulcers would develop quicker. Now, the really cool thing here is feeding the smaller meals throughout the day does not just prevent ulcers. It also helps prevent colic, which is every horse owner's worst nightmare. When the stomach and the intestines are empty and then overfilled with a big meal, it greatly increases the chance of the horse getting an obstruction or an impaction. Horses also have a very limited ability to digest starch because they produce very limited amylase, which is the enzyme that digests starch. If they are fed too big of a meal at once, that undigested starch will pass into the hindgut, and that can also cause colic. To be fair, I will say a wild horse may get some kind of colic from possibly rolling too hard and getting their intestines tangled up, but that is very unlikely. So what can you do to emulate this with your own horse? You can keep your horse on acreage, not a dry lot, but that is the best option. There doesn't have to be lush green grass. In fact, there probably shouldn't be because most horses couldn't handle it, but I will get to that more in lesson number 4. There can be dried grass or brush or anything that your horse can just nibble on throughout the day. If that is not an option for you, the second best thing you can do is to feed small meals of hay throughout the day, with the first being early in the morning and the last being late at night, so they go as short a time as possible without having anything to eat. You can use slow feeders, but you want to get one that is on the ground, not hanging or up high at all, which leads us into lesson number 2. Horses in the wild are eating off the ground. They don't eat out of hay bags or corner feeders in a stall. There are 2 main reasons it's better for horses to eat off the ground. The first is that it helps prevent choke and colic. This is because the head and neck are in their natural feeding position. All these fancy feeding stations and contraptions people have invented are actually dangerous for our horses to use. The second reason you want your horse to be eating off the ground is that it wears their teeth in a much more natural way. As any horse owner knows, you have to get your horse's teeth floated every year to take those sharp points down. Now, obviously, horses in the wild do not get their teeth floated. So, do their teeth get too sharp and cause them pain their whole lives? No, they do not. Because they are living and eating as nature intended, their teeth are getting worn down naturally as well. The more we deviate from this, the more often our domestic horses need to get their teeth done. The more we feed grains over high fiber forage, anytime our horses are not eating at ground level, this is causing them to need to get their teeth floated more often. Horses in the wild are not only eating off the ground, they're actually ripping the grass or brush from the ground instead of having it already cut as hay. They are chewing on rocks to get minerals. So is this to say wild horses never have dental problems? Of course not, but for the most part, they have a way better dental health than most of our domestic horses. To set your horse up for optimal dental health, you can 1, make sure they're eating at ground level, and 2, let them get as much of their nutrients as possible directly from the earth and out of the pasture. And 3, when you do feed, choose hay over grains, except as a carrier to give supplements, Or if you are really trying to put some weight on your horse, then you can supplement with beet pulp or brands, but that should be supplemental on top of hay. If your horse is old and has lost a lot of teeth and can't chew, then of course feed grains. Even if you follow these guidelines, you will still have to get your horse's teeth loaded because it is impossible to have the exact same conditions in domestic life as in the wild. But you will not need to get them done as often. One more benefit to feeding this way and not having to get their teeth floated as often is that they will have their teeth for longer. The more you get your horse's teeth floated, the faster they run out of tooth. If you're enjoying this video and you want to go deeper and learn more about improving horse and hoof health through diet and lifestyle, you can download my ebook, Hoof Health from the Inside Out, Diet, Nutrition, and Lifestyle for Healthy Hooves, for free by clicking the link in the description of this video. On to lesson number 3. Now this is a big one. I bet you can guess what it is. Horses in the wild do not have shoes, and surprise, surprise, not really a surprise though, they have the best hooves around. First I want to say is that not all wild horses have hooves that look the same. Wild horses from living all around the world in different climates and on different terrains have hooves that all look a little different. But each are exactly what those horses need for the conditions that they live in. That is the magic of horses and their hooves. They are incredibly adaptive and they have so much intelligence innately in their bodies that they know exactly what they need. In the wild, horses do not have to get their hooves trimmed as they are traveling 20 plus miles per day and they are wearing them down perfectly at the rate at which they are growing. They will never wear down their hooves too much. I have actually had someone tell me that this was why their horses needed shoes, because their horses' hooves were wearing down faster than they could grow, which is impossible unless the horse was malnourished, because stimulation causes growth. So the more the horse moves, the faster the hoof will grow. Anyways, wild horses can move effortlessly across rocky terrain. Their hooves have beautiful sole concavity, a natural Mustang roll, they have strong frogs, and most importantly, well-developed internal structures of the hoof. This is from getting up and moving across rocky ground right away after birth. They do not get white line disease, they do not get contracted heels, they do not have thin soles, and last but definitely not least, they do not get laminitis or founder. Unless maybe if they were to wander onto a lush green cattle pasture, then their bodies would go into shock, but I will get more into this in the next lesson. A horse's hooves are only as hard as the ground they are on the most often, and they are incredibly adaptive. So to apply all this to our own domestic horses, you should first make sure that they are getting regular barefoot hoof trims. You don't want your horse's hooves to get too long in between trims because long hoof walls put excess strain on the lamina. Shoes are not only unnecessary, but they are actually harmful. A good Mustang roll or hoof bevel is key to emulating the hoof of the wild horse in our own domestic horses. You also want to be really aggressive in treating thrush. Wild horses are not standing around in manure and urine, so they are not really getting thrushed, which causes contracted heels. You may have to use boots when riding on rocky ground if your horse does not live on very rocky ground. Remember, a horse's hooves are only as tough as the ground they are on the most often. And you don't want your barefoot horse to go on ground that he's not accustomed to and make him walk on his tiptoes or become sore. Lesson number 4, wild horses do not eat sugary grains or lush green grass, and they do not get carbohydrate overload, which triggers laminitis and founder. Yes, laminitis can be caused by mechanical factors, but the majority of laminitis and founder cases are caused by diet. And I think it speaks volumes that wild horses do not get laminitis. The only exceptions to this would be what I mentioned earlier, if they got onto some cattle grazing ground that had lots of green grass, or they got some kind of injury on one leg that caused them to favor the other leg. Then it's possible they could get mechanical laminitis on the leg that they were favoring and compensating with, but this is a very rare occurrence. Laminitis by carbohydrate overload is the number 2 killer of horses, second only to colic, which I already went over why they don't get colic. Now we are 2 for 2 on the top 2 killers of domestic horses, being pretty much non-existent in the wild. Pretty crazy to think about. So to apply all this to our domestic horses, the first thing to do is cut out all sugary grains and complete feeds. They are not really complete at all, and they also do not feed anything with molasses. It's completely unnecessary. Even if your horse is not an easy keeper, these sugary grains are terrible for your horse's health. It's also important to say that Your horse may not be very overweight or having laminitic episodes, but carbohydrate overload could still be affecting your horse's hoof health. This can look like flares in the hoof wall, white line disease, seedy toe, event rings going down the hoof wall. And if your horse has any of these hoof issues, or you just have an easier keeper, or a horse with a crest or fat pockets, or a horse with a history of laminitis, you are probably going to want to switch to a teff hay or to a grass hay that has been tested for low sugar. Hay will have different levels of sugar depending on the time of day it was cut and which cutting it is. So getting tested hay is always the safest bet. You want to look for the NSC%. This stands for non-structural carbohydrates. You want to be below 10% ideally, but below 12% is okay if that's all you can find. Now, if you can't get tested hay and you can't get teff hay, then the next safest bet would be to soak your grass hay. This is tedious, but if your horse is really struggling with weight gain or is actually having a laminitic episode, it will make a huge difference. A grazing muzzle is also a great option if there is grass in the pasture. That way your horse can still be out and nibbling and hanging out with the other horses without binging on grass all day long. Some domestic horses do have the opposite problem and they need extra help keeping the weight on. You still don't want to feed those sugary grains to them. You can opt for beet pulp or bran. They're both great options here. And even smaller percent of horses that get intense exercise regularly may benefit from some grain to help replenish those glucose stores, but this is truly a small percent. The majority of horses only need hay as their main source of food, and then vitamins and minerals supplemented in a small amount of grass or teff pellets. Lesson number 5 is that wild horses live in herds. This one is pretty straight to the point. Horses are herd animals. They have incredibly advanced hierarchy and language that they communicate with. They learn manners from each other and they protect each other from predators. They are more content and less stressed when they have a herd or at least one companion. Being able to see other horses is simply not enough. They need to live together in the same living space for their own emotional well-being. They need to be able to groom each other and swat flies from each other, to play, and to take turns laying down. This is something I hear all the time. Well, my horse shares a fence with another horse, so he's fine. No, your horse may be fine, as in not noticeably distressed, but fine should not be the standard. Horses are very stoic creatures when it comes to emotional pain as well as physical pain. They do not bark like dogs or meow like cats. Often when there is physical pain, it will become out as a behavior problem, which most will just try to train out with harsher and harsher methods. So one thing that all of these lessons show is that the majority of domestic horses are actually under much more stress than the wild horses. Yes, of course, wild horses do feel stress, but the stress in the wild is the stress they are meant to feel as flight or prey animals. The stress horses get from domestic life is completely different. It is from being so far removed from how they have actually evolved to live. Stress causes heightened cortisol. Now, acute stress and acute high cortisol is beneficial to, say, run from a predator or for a stallion to fight off a bachelor trying to take his mares. But chronic stress means chronically high cortisol, which has many negative side effects. These include weakened immune system, aggressive behavior, decreased growth in young horses, diarrhea, and most notably colic and gastric ulcers. Gastric ulcers are an epidemic in horses. It is estimated that over 60% of show horses have gastric ulcers, most undiagnosed. And these ulcers are not just in the stomach from not being fed often enough, but they can also be in the small intestine and hindgut as well. So what are the most common stressors that domestic horses face despite having a safer and easier life? Well, there is stress from being kept away from other horses, whether that is just on the other side of the fence or actually alone on a property. Even more stress from being kept in a stall. Stress from not having forage to nibble on freely. There is stress from intense training and showing, especially traveling to and from shows regularly. Am I saying to not show your horses? No, but you can do so in a way that is safest and easiest on the horse. After all, your horse is giving his all for you. We can do our best to care for them the best that we know how as well. And this may not look like you think it does. It looks like keeping them in a pasture with at least one other horse. They don't need a fancy box stall. They just need a shelter to go in if they so choose to. It looks like having forage in the living space or feeding small meals throughout the day, as we have already talked about. It looks like feeding herbs to reduce stress and slippery elm to buffer the gut when traveling to these shows. Always having hay in the trailer and no more than 6 hours in the trailer per day.